The International Monetary Fund expects India's GDP to contract by 4.5% in the current fiscal, and that is a steep downward revision of 640 basis points from the forecast that it made in April when it had pegged the economy to grow at 1.9%. That's also the sharpest cut for all other major economies. According to the IMF, India's longer than expected lockdown has slowed recovery, resulting in a downward revision. Further, the IMF expects the global economy to contract by 4.9% in 2020. Well, to discuss the projections and the unprecedented challenges that the world is facing, I have with me Geeta Gopinath, the Chief Economist of the International Monetary Fund. Geeta, appreciate you joining us here on CNBC-TV18. Let me start by asking you about that sharp cut for India, a 640 basis point cut over the projection made in April. And this is still your baseline scenario, Geeta. Beyond the lockdown, extended lockdown imposition, what else has contributed to this sharp cut? And what could the worst case scenario be given the circumstances?
Hi, Shireen. So yes, I would say the two of the important factors were, one, that the lockdowns, and these include partial lockdowns, are now in place, have been in place, and are expected to be in place for much longer than we had anticipated in April. So that was one factor. The second factor is that because despite the containment measures in India, you continue to see the cases rise, and so the health crisis is certainly not abated yet. We are now projecting a slower recovery. We expect much more persistent social distancing, and that will have an effect on activities. Combined with the fact that there are some structural vulnerabilities in the financial sector. And so these factors are what have led to the downgrade.
The consensus estimate at this point in time, if you look at what other brokerages, etc., are suggesting, and other rating agencies are also suggesting, is a 5% contraction at the least for India. You're still going with 4.5%, Geeta. You also talked about the financial sector's vulnerabilities. What specifically are you most concerned about there? And if this case rise continues at this pace, what do you believe the implications could be as far as the projections are concerned?
So in terms of financial vulnerabilities, I mean, what we all know is that even before this crisis, there were structural vulnerabilities in the financial sector, the banking system, the NBFCs, the HFCs. And if this crisis prolongs, and there is a bigger hit to activity, which can give rise to more non-performing loans, more insolvencies, and that clearly will have an impact. And we know also before this crisis, there was already a high level of risk aversion among the banking sector in terms of lending. And again, all this uncertainty can only hamper that even more. You asked me about what could be a worst case outcome. So we did a simulation of what would happen if there was a second wave around the world. And so for at least on the global level, what that means is that instead of growth being 5.4% at the global level, it would be basically 0%, which is the the classic L-shaped non-recovery that we would have from this crisis.
Geeta, let me ask you about the impact or what you make of the impact of the measures announced both by the government as well as the central bank. In the last conversation that we had, you said that the central bank has done a good job in the liquidity measures that had been announced. We've seen this package being announced by the Indian government. Do you believe that that is enough to be able to aid the kind of recovery that we hope for?
So there has been many measures taken, both in terms of monetary policy and fiscal policy and financial support. So as an aggregate, the support has been quite substantial. And the recent announcements from the RBI in terms of liquidity support for NBFCs and HFCs, helping with credit, and lending, all of that is absolutely welcome. In terms of the fiscal side, I think what India has done a lot more of is what one calls off-budget spending, which is in the form of loans and credit guarantees, as opposed to on-budget spending, which is in the form of kind of more direct income support. So that is about 1.5% of GDP at this time for India. And I think there is certainly space to do more, especially to help the most vulnerable, poor people and small and medium enterprises.
So if you believe that there is space to do more on the fiscal side, and you believe that the fiscal support, the direct fiscal support, is about 1.5% of GDP, given the debt to GDP ratio, and that, of course, has been a concern for India. We went into the crisis with a very high level. Does that leave room then for additional direct fiscal support, you think?
So if you look, again, just to be clear, the overall support on the fiscal side is about 6.5%. But again, 1.5% is the one that's on budget. In terms of the ability to do more, I think it certainly has. If you just look at the borrowing rates for the government, because of the fact that interest rates have come down around the world, including the RBI cutting rates, the government can borrow at a lower rate now than it could a few months ago. And financial conditions are relatively in a better shape as opposed to the real economy in the world. So yes, this crisis will cause debt to go up. It will cause deficits to go up. We're projecting India's deficit to be around 12%, the consolidated deficit this year. But this is a crisis that requires measures at this point, because if you don't, and you don't get the recovery that you need to bring back bring those debt levels down and to reduce the fiscal deficit, I think you would be in even worse shape. So this would be a crisis that would require a front-loaded response.
Okay, you believe that a front-loaded response is necessary at this point in time. Geeta, you've also been talking about the need to build a job-rich recovery, and if that means providing subsidies to firms to hire, so be it. Now, given the fact that in India we haven't seen that kind of direct support, do you believe that there is merit for the government to consider that as we move forward?
When the country is in a stable recovery and people are returning to work, they have an incentive to return to work, and they're less worried about contracting an illness. At that stage, we would have to see a pivoting away from support to keep people at home to encouraging people to return to work, and also in terms of hiring. Now, when you think of hiring subsidies, it's usually not a blanket hiring subsidy, but you want hiring subsidies that encourage hiring of workers who otherwise have the risk of becoming long-term unemployed. And that kind of targeted hiring subsidy would absolutely help.
Geeta, one of the other factors that we now need to contend with when we talk about the India story and the path to recovery is the standoff with China and what that would mean in terms of import restrictions, retaliatory measures, etc. And all of this is still a matter under discussion. But do you believe that India should, at this point in time, consider higher import restrictions, bans on imports from China, and what could that mean for the Indian economy given the trade deficit?
So Shireen, I mean, many countries in the world are reassessing the benefits of globalization, but I think we should just keep one thing very clear, which is, and this is true for India too, which is that if you want to have a job-rich recovery, I mean, and India wants to be a big player on the export markets. It wants a big manufacturing push, a Make in India push. In that case, being a part of global supply chains is very important, because you get your intermediate inputs from the rest of the world to be able to do that. And so therefore, policies that encourage more integration with the world as opposed to backing off is just more, it would be a best practice more generally for everywhere. And there are countries in this crisis that were putting restrictions on medical exports, and we called on that for that stopping. That hasn't completely stopped, but we certainly want more of those restrictions to be lifted. And so again, if you have to step back and think of from a kind of a more holistic development strategy, which is one where you want to have a bigger manufacturing sector, where you want to have more jobs, integration has in general helped. Now, of course, there will be some communities that will get affected from it, and that's where domestic policies have to play a very important role.
This